Recently, Netflix came out with a new World War II documentary series titled World War II on the Front Lines. While obviously World War II documentaries are quite the saturated market, this series manages to distinguish itself. Admittedly, it's not as educational as other series, and this isn't where I would go to learn about the political or military history of the war. Where Frontlines really shines, however, is its immersiveness. Without the talking head historians, the series can focus all its time on showing you footage and first-hand accounts from the war. Instead of an expert telling you about Churchill's speeches or American isolationist sentiment or a woman in the Soviet army, you hear the actual newsreels and interviews. The restored and colorized footage is really incredible in some places, and I was saying it's similar to movies from the 1970s. Although I admit some of the colorization does definitely fall into a kind of uncanny valley territory, I think it will get better with time. Another thing that Frontlines does well is that it also focuses on less well-known parts of World War II. While classics like Normandy and Stalingrad and Midway are shown, much of the coverage is on other areas. Some standouts in my opinion include the experiences of colonial soldiers, the Italian campaign, and the British bombing of Hamburg. Overall, I'd really recommend this series. Again, it's not something that you'll learn a lot of history from on its own, but it shines a light on parts of the war that aren't talked about as much, and some of those stories are really worth it, and again, it's World War II like you've never seen before, honestly. That's like a played out thing, but it really is true, I think. The episode that made me want to make this video is episode 5, Invasion. This one looks at the year 1944 as the Allies are closing in on all sides. The Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy, D-Day in France, and the steady Soviet advance on the Eastern Front. But while the Allies were pushing in, resistance movements rose up on opposite ends of Europe to win their independence from the Germans. These twin uprisings were in Paris and Warsaw, and they took place at the same time, but saw drastically different results. And when I watched this part of the episode, it really resonated with me seeing the contrast. A big part of it is because I have Polish heritage, and I just wrote a paper that dealt with the Warsaw Uprising, but I noticed that I couldn't help but almost get annoyed at the Parisians. But to explain what I mean and see if I'm being unfair, let's rewind to the lead-up of these uprisings and then dive into them individually. As always, remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Also, sorry for not posting a lot recently. I just started a new job and had finals, but I should be able to play catch-up now over the holidays. So, let's look at the resistance movements in Poland and France in World War II. As we all know, the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939 to start the war, and I have a video on the first battle of the war here if you're interested in checking that out. The Polish military fell in only 3 weeks, and notably, the government never surrendered, and still technically was in power out in London. As a result, there was a well-organized shadow government during the occupation. The Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, AK, did everything from carry out court proceedings and executions, deliver welfare and pension benefits, and conduct intelligence work against the Germans. They would have such important contributions as exposing the V-2 rocket program, as well as the German camps throughout Poland. While a military element existed as well, it was notably quite dormant for most of the war. This was mostly due to a lack of external support, something that we'll touch on in a moment. In terms of organization, the AK answered to the Polish Prime Minister in exile, Władysław Sikorski. Sikorski would die in a plane crash in 1943, however, and by the time of the uprising, the PM was Stanisław Mikołajczyk. In Poland, the Home Army commander would take up the PM's orders, as well as run the show in country. At the time of the Warsaw Uprising, this commander was General Tadeusz Bor Komorowski. At its peak, the AK consisted of 400,000 members nationwide, and it was the second largest resistance movement in Europe. Other Polish resistance movements existed as well, although they were far smaller than the AK. Many times a group of young men would simply form their own group of a few people before melding into the wider AK. But like all of Europe, there were more politically extreme groups in Poland. The Narodowe Siły Zbrojne, NSZ, was a far-right nationalist group mostly made up of soldiers, while the Armia Ludowa, AL, and the peasant brigades were communists. Just by dint of being so big, the AK was more centrist in nature, but it wasn't without its divides. According to Donny Gluckstein, Borkomorowski was actually having leftists within the AK and other groups killed, and anti-Semitism was a common feature in Poland generally as well. The AK would help Jews on occasion, but the Ghetto Uprising in 1943 was a largely independent venture by the Jews, and the AK did little more than try to supply them on occasion. Moving over to France, we have a somewhat different story. France wouldn't be invaded until the next year, and it too fell relatively quickly in just 6 weeks. Rather than being totally conquered like Poland, France instead surrendered before the whole country was conquered. The northern part of France, including Paris, became occupied by the Germans, while the southern part, based out of Vichy, became a collaborator state with Germany. Initially, resistance wasn't organized, save for a Free French army that had evacuated the country with Charles de Gaulle. The Germans responded to the isolated resistance with harsh reprisals, and the lack of organization meant that the movements were mostly political. While communists had historically been the best group for subterfuge in France, they had remained neutral as long as the Germans were friendly with the Soviets. This changed in Operation Barbarossa, which activated the French Communist Party and its militant wing, the FTP. As the war went on, the resistance became more militant and more organized. In late 1942, the German military occupied Vichy, France, out of fear of an invasion from Africa, and early the next year they began to deport French workers to Germany for the failing war effort. These in tandem sped along the flight of people out of the cities into the countryside, where they joined the Marquis, various rural resistance bands that attacked the Germans. Around the same time, French resistance organized around Jean Moulin and the MUR, or Mouvement Unis de Resistance, which combined multiple groups in the south, including the FTP communists. This consolidation with Moulin, who worked with de Gaulle but would later die in German captivity, allowed for far greater coordination with each other and notably with Europe. And that brings us to the first major difference between these two resistance movements. The French got a lot of support from the Allies. Suitcase radios were dropped for the resistance and allowed for two-way communication regarding everything from coordinating attacks to supply drops. Many Canadian, American, and English agents, especially from the SOE, parachuted in and helped to coordinate the French actions. Lots of weapons and ammo also were given to the French, although this was mostly small arms, and it wasn't enough. According to the War Stories documentary on the French resistance, I'll have all the links in the description, only 1 in 5 men could be equipped. For reference, the French resistance totaled was thought to have been as many as 500,000 people, which may have actually been larger than what was in Poland, but these numbers are kind of disputed, and France was way bigger, so it's entirely possible. That being said, the French received 18 times more aid than the Poles ever did. At its peak, the AK had created the largest underground arms manufacturing operation in history and made its own submachine gun, the Błyskawica, which you can actually see in the Warsaw Uprising Museum. Even so, they were only ever in possession of 32,000 guns for the whole country. Part of this, of course, is just a geography issue. France is much closer to England and to Africa, so it was able to receive a reasonable amount of supply through the whole war. Poland, by contrast, was kind of out there as far as the West was concerned, although they did manage to get some supplies to them by 1944. But I hear you saying, the Soviets are right there. Couldn't they help or something? And you're right, the Soviets were right there, and arguably had a safer time at giving supplies to the Poles. But that gets us into the main reason that these two resistances had very different supplies. The Poles had to deal with Stalin and the USSR. Now, the USSR were a fan of resistance groups, They of course had ties with the French FTP and played a large role in supporting resistance movements in Yugoslavia and Greece, as well as their own country when they got invaded. They knew how to do it, and they were pretty good at funding and coordinating partisan warfare. The issue was, the Soviets weren't a fan of the Poles. Stalin purged over 100,000 Poles in his Great Terror of the 1930s, and he was ferociously paranoid that Polish communist groups would pose a threat to him. Further, he co-invaded Poland with Germany in 1939. Why would you support resistance groups in the country that you just invaded? As such, there weren't any communist groups that Stalin even wanted to work with in Poland. By the time it did become useful for him to weaponize the Poles against the Germans, he had created his own Polish Communist Party and Polish Soviet Army, both under his control. These groups directly opposed the government in exile and the AK, and as such, he had no problem pushing the Polish resistance aside and putting his own collaborators in. And since Stalin wasn't a fan of Polish resistance, the other allies had to keep them at arm's length as well in order to keep relations with Stalin smooth. So, how did this disparity factor into the summer and fall of 1944? Well, let's go chronologically. On June 5th, 1944, a coded message on the radio alerted the French resistance groups to take action. As the Allies moved on D-Day, French resistance around the country sabotaged German communications and logistics lines, slowing their ability to reinforce Normandy for the invasion. They would keep this up all through the summer as the north of France was liberated. Some areas in Brittany were actually independently liberated by the French without the Allies, a stunning feat given their armament. In the south, attempts were made at conventional action with Allied support, but these sadly were crushed by the Germans. Further centralization of the French resistance came as de Gaulle and his England-based Free French united with the resistance, creating the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur. I'm sure I said that right. The FFI. Through the rest of the liberation, the FFI would aid in sabotage more than direct combat, having a great impact on the Allies' warfront. Earlier in the year, the Poles had activated Operation Tempest, where AK groups would rise up near the advancing front lines to help the Soviets beat the Germans. The first fighting started in March, but major engagements didn't occur until July, notably in Wilno and Lwów. You'll notice those cities are no longer part of Poland. Polish weapons were sent east to aid in these efforts, but in not too long the issue of cooperation reared its head. In both of these places, Polish forces were able to occupy the city in part, and in the case of Lwów, actually took it before the Soviets got there. But as we said, the Soviets weren't fans of alternative armed groups. As soon as the Germans were defeated, the Soviets turned on the Poles, disarming them, pressing them into service, and arresting those who wanted to go free. Already, we can see the stark contrast between the Allies and the Soviets. Then, as August approached, so too did the uprising. The Poles by this point were desperate. They knew that the Soviets had no interest in working with them, and the Prime Minister, Mikołajczyk, was bound for a meeting in Moscow with Stalin over the future of the nation. At this point, it was still even up in the air if the exile government would even be recognized after the war, and even more pressing was the question of Polish borders, which Stalin was keen on shifting, and as we know, he ended up getting his way. The Allies weren't much help, and at the same time, the Germans were in full retreat. In late July, Mikołajczyk appointed Komorowski to launch an uprising in Warsaw, a spur-of-the-moment, somewhat desperate attempt to secure the capital from the Soviets and maintain some leverage and independence in the post-war order. There was also fear that the AL communists would rise up instead at the behest of the Soviets. At the same time, the Germans were planning on deporting thousands of men from Warsaw for the war effort, which would hamstring the AK, and resistance was in the air. Even if the AK did nothing, it was almost certain that the people of Warsaw would have risen up on their own, and it's honestly surprising when reading accounts from the time just how high the morale was. So despite the fact that the AK had sent most of its weapons to the east for Operation Tempest, the uprising was scheduled for August 1st, a day after Mikołajczyk arrived in Moscow. On that day, Vyacheslav Molotov reported that the Soviet forces were within 10 miles of Warsaw, and in Warsaw there had been sightings of Soviet tanks in the eastern suburbs next to the Vistula River. But to the chagrin of all involved, their position wouldn't last, and they wouldn't be able to move into Warsaw right away. On August 1st, at 5 p.m., the Home Army mobilized and attacked the Germans. In the first 3 days, the force of 40,000 was able to seize control of most of the city. However, due to limited weapons, they couldn't overrun the fortified German positions, including the German command at the Brugl Palace. The critical failure of the uprising, aside from the questionable initiation timing, was the chronic lack of weapons. In fact, it's so low that we can count the guns. The AK had about 1,000 rifles, 25,000 grenades, that's a little better, 2,000 pistols, 60 SMGs, and only 7 proper machine guns. Almost 250,000 rifle rounds, only 35,000 machine gun rounds, and around 7,000 Molotovs rounded out the armament, as well as a handful of anti-tank rockets and flamethrowers. All of this for at least 40,000 fighters, so less than 10% of people could have a gun. Right. But amazingly, the Poles were able to hold out for a while. German support came from the west, and the initial actions of the SS were brutal since they were under orders to destroy the whole city and kill everyone in it. In the first 2 days after their arrival, they killed 40,000 people, almost all civilians. The Polish territory dwindled, but certain areas like Piedna Street and Jerozolimskie Avenue were strong choke points where the AK repeatedly repulsed German attacks, inflicting heavy casualties. But again, due to the lack of weapons and ammo, these positions had to be given up, even though the Germans had no real way to actually take them. Meanwhile, out in France, the Allies pushed through the country and approached Paris. Eisenhower actually wanted to go around the city out of fear of urban combat, plus the Germans had an order to destroy the city if it was attacked. But despite that, fighting would break out anyway. Through the 15th to 18th of August, a strike spread around Paris, and on the 19th, members of the Paris police retook their famous headquarters on the Seine as the call for resistance in the city went out. Resistance spread to the populace, taking up arms and creating barricades in the typical French fashion, with the FTP taking a major role in organization. Most of the French positions were in the city center, while 5,000 Germans were stationed around the city, and another 20,000 surrounded Paris to fight the Allies. Light fighting in the city took place, but when the Germans tried to exit their fortifications on the 22nd, this reached its fever pitch, and the next day the Germans used heavy weapons on the French, including at the Grand Palais. But help was on the way. De Gaulle had reasoned with Eisenhower to relieve the French resistance, and the two shared concern over the strong FTP presence in the city. So on August 24th, French forces entered Paris, and the next day the Germans surrendered. Sources aren't clear if this move was the French violating American orders or if de Gaulle had convinced Eisenhower, but either way, Paris was saved, and soon so would the rest of France. Back in Warsaw, things were far from over. The AK knew they couldn't hold out much longer, and Borkomowski had initially anticipated his forces could last 3 days against a moderate resistance. It was well past that point, and still no one was coming. The Soviets had initially not been able to securely push towards Warsaw, but by the end of the month, they had consolidated and had regained the ability to help, at least by air, even if not by land. But here we see the Soviet ambitions rear their head most cruelly. The Western Allies had pled for the Soviets to aid the Poles, but Stalin kept giving excuses ranging from, "Oh, I can't," to "the uprising is a lost cause, there's no point in helping anyway." He even blocked English air crews from using Soviet airfields, but welcomed them to try and supply the Poles if they felt like it. And as it turns out, they did feel like it, and they flew extremely dangerous missions from Italy to resupply the AK, although as you would imagine, it wasn't very high in quantity. Eventually, the Soviets agreed to help, but they didn't use any parachutes on their supply drops, and a vast majority of the supplies was unusable. The AK was in constant retreat, moving towards the old town and using sewer systems to communicate and evacuate the waves of civilians fleeing the German terror. The whole time, the Soviets gathered on the opposite bank of the Vistula and watched. Fighting and destruction would continue for another month, until on October 2nd, the AK surrendered to the Germans, an extreme rarity given that the Germans didn't treat partisans according to the laws of war. On one end of the continent, freedom was won. While the uprising did little militarily, it helped the Allies decide to come into Paris proper and liberate the capital. It also helped ensure that de Gaulle's provisional government would be the ones to control France after the war. On the other end, Warsaw was destroyed. The Germans held the city until January, at which point the Soviets marched in and took the whole city in just 3 days, the same amount of time it took the AK to reach its greatest control and to control most of the city. In the intervening months, the Germans had systematically destroyed the city. When the Soviets did finally enter, 85% of the buildings were totally destroyed. The Warsaw Uprising was also far, far bloodier than the Parisian liberation. The FFI resistance in France lost about 1,600 soldiers and over 3,000 Germans were killed, although it's likely that most of these deaths were from the Allies coming into Paris. Another 500 civilians also died. In Warsaw, the Germans lost as many as 17,000 men to the AK's 15,200. But 200,000 Polish civilians were killed, and another 700,000 were displaced, with thousands upon thousands being sent to camps. I mentioned earlier that the Parisians had sort of annoyed me, and that's true. It's not really fair, to be fair, but to my point, I'm not the only one that felt that way. Those who rose up in Paris were actually ridiculed by the resistance around the country who had been fighting for years. The freedom fighters in the capital were branded as Resistance of the month of August. As far as uprisings went, this was kind of small beans. And again, I'm talking about Paris specifically, not the wider French resistance. The Allies were going to liberate them anyway, and at best it just made the liberation happen sooner. They didn't really make things easier for the Allies as they had across France, and it kind of just gave me a sort of LARPy vibe. Again, obviously they were really fighting and really people died, but it was almost like jumping on the bandwagon of resistance. And this isn't me bad-mouthing the whole French resistance, again, just the Parisians. And as this LARP uprising happened in Paris, one of the bloodiest parts of the war was happening at the same time against the same enemy, and unlike the Parisians, the Poles had no real options if they failed. And they paid a way, way, way higher cost for their efforts. I know all of my anti-Parisian talk sounds harsh, and I'm not even saying that the Parisians shouldn't have risen up or anything. I guess it just kind of, it struck a chord with me when it was contrasted with what happened in Warsaw. And this documentary seemed to me to do a really good job at that, contrasting the celebrating French in Paris with their city intact, playing patriotic music, and then it would cut to piles of bodies and the flattened city of Warsaw. So that's just my biased opinion on the whole thing. I hope you enjoyed. Please don't be mad. I don't know, it's unreasonable to some degree, right? Because it's like, oh, we're all on the same side and that and all that. But I guess it was just, there was the history of the French kind of really sold out the Poles at the beginning of the war. They weren't the only ones, mind you. And then just kind of the way that this is touted as like, whoa, look at this incredible Parisian resistance, even though it was like the least incredible part of the entire French resistance. And it was like not comparable to, the Warsaw Uprising, for example. But it was successful, even though, again, it was the Allies, right? The Allies were the successful ones in that one. Alright, I'm gonna stop talking about this. Merry Christmas or New Year's or whenever this comes out, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.